Welcome everyone to our business series of webinars. Today you will be hearing from Duality's Chief Business Officer, Michael Hughes, and our VP of Strategy, Ronen Cohen. As always, our goal with these webinars is to keep them short, as we know how critical time is for all of us. Not a complete slide-free zone, but we focus more on the discussion versus the slideware. Please use the chat function to ask questions at any time during the session, as we want to keep this as interactive as possible. Now, without further ado, welcome to Extracting Value from Your Data, Capitalize on Insights, Not Privacy. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Lucy, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I think that as we look at both the evolution of data, both in terms of how it's been used and the value that's being derived from it, we've seen something that is now kind of achieving an exponential growth curve, because initially just from collection and storage of data, that was interesting because you could now actually run reports, but organizations quickly realized, well, actually I can do much more thorough analysis and develop business intelligence on that data. That then quickly evolved to, and I would argue we're still relatively early in this particular phase of using technology, using artificial intelligence to drive learnings from these particular data sets using all sorts of models. But organizations, once they've gone through this evolution of understanding what can be done with the data, what we're starting to see is that the next phase that organizations are trying to move to quickly is how do they leverage the data for better collaboration, both internally and externally, to drive new business, generate incremental revenue, improve healthcare that actually can benefit all of us as individuals. So organizations to do this are beginning to leverage this term of we're trying to become a data-driven enterprise. As the recognition in the ability to leverage data to positively impact their business through collaboration, what we're finding is that organizations are getting to the work that are required to make this a reality. They're transforming their business to where all of their data can be leveraged to build better relationships with their customers, drive more insights into how their products and services are being consumed, and doing so in a way that protects the sensitive data that needs to be protected due to both compliance and regulatory requirements, but also the fact that you have a fair amount of intellectual property and, of course, your reputation that needs to be protected while you're leveraging this data in a more effective way. And this can only be made possible is if that data can be shared while ensuring that what needs to remain private always remains private and never is exposed to an unintended party. To get there, though, what we're finding is that there are some challenges associated with becoming a data-driven enterprise. Agreeing to share the data is one thing, but then once you say that, there's a lot that goes into it. There's a need to understand the nuances of the regulations in the places that you want to share data, because not only from country to country do they vary, but here in the United States, they're varying from state to state. How is it that you determine which of the data needs to remain private in this notion when you want to share more of it? You need to determine who needs to get access to that information, and to do so while being able to address the reporting requirements to show compliance with the applicable regulations that you are bound by. And I think that ultimately to do this, the one other thing that needs to be taken into consideration is, do you have the appropriate and necessary consent? So while becoming a data-driven enterprise is intuitively obvious, it's initially challenging in practice. But what I'd like you to think about is what you would be able to do organizationally if you could use all the data at your disposal, all of the data, not just some of the data. So what we're finding that organizations are making the decision to deploy an enterprise-ready end-to-end data sharing platform. And really, it's just a question of when they're going to do it. And it's no longer a question of if. But as organizations looking to move in this direction, they want to drastically improve business outcomes, ultimately because they're able to make more informed decisions by leveraging data that was previously locked away, and doing so all within a governance framework that makes it easy to show how data is being used. Now, the use cases are varied, but most have a definitive impact to revenue. A couple examples of those are things like being able to provide more targeted offers to your banking clients by sharing information with third-party partners about what is being spent on certain goods and services, such that they can actually provide better goods and services to you that you can then choose to make offers to your clients about, without revealing anything about the individual to those third parties. Or another example would be being able to reduce the instance of bank or insurance fraud by enabling companies to ask each other questions about individuals or companies that might be engaging in fraudulent activity without revealing anything about the person or company suspected of that behavior. Now, with that, I'll pass it over to Renan, who has deep roots in privacy and policy and works closely with many organizations that are trying to do exactly what it is we're talking about. So Renan, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. One of the things that you said that resonated with me was about accessing all the data that's available to you. And this is really an important word and a paradigm shift. Historically, when you think of all the data that's available to you, you probably think of what my team has. But today, given the technology landscape and given the need to use data, we're seeing organizations start to think more widely. What is the data available to other teams in my organization? What is the data available to other branches or jurisdictions in my organization? And what is the data available to other organizations that could be valuable to me or could be valuable to us jointly? And so as we go through a few different examples of the challenge in using data, but the value in doing so, I urge you to think of what data you might be able to gain value from that isn't necessarily available to you today. And so the things that we'll look at is how to break down silos, not only internal ones, but cross-organizational ones. How to do so while ensuring both vertical compliance, so for example, with HIPAA in healthcare or BSA in banking, as well as horizontal compliance like GDPR and CCPA. And importantly, in addition to compliance, one also has to think about competition. At the end, we're private enterprises and we're here to make money and revenue, exactly as Michael said. And so understanding how one can fully leverage all data available to you while still ensuring privacy and competition is really paramount. And I'll go through a couple of different use cases and examples that hopefully will illuminate this. So the first example, if we can move forward, is in financial services. A typical financial institution might only see 10 to 25% of its own customers' activity, because that activity is spread out across different institutions, different apps, different investment platforms, and so on and so forth. And what that means is that a typical financial institution doesn't actually know its own customers. How can one expect a bank, for example, to effectively develop products to people that it doesn't know, or market to people that it doesn't know, or mitigate risk effectively? And so one of the use cases that Michael alluded to is around fighting financial crimes like cyber crimes and fraud and money laundering, where by the very nature of it, the data is spread out across the globe. And so this challenge is, how can you actually get a wider view of risk while still being able to maintain privacy and regulation? And so we're seeing organizations start to use privacy technologies that allow them to work together and to collaborate to understand money flows, account ownership, suspicious activity in a way that ensures that everything that they're doing is totally compliant, totally safe, and totally secure. As another example, we can look to healthcare, where obviously the goal is keeping us all healthy and keeping us all safe. And a very typical example for this is around rare diseases. Rare diseases really aren't so rare. They're rare to an organization, but something like 10% of the global population has some sort of rare disease. It's just spread out. The data is spread out everywhere. And there are blockers in accessing that data. But if we could, one could get a more holistic view, get more confidence in the data, get more fidelity in the results that they're getting, and actually use that to create better drugs, create better treatments, understand correlations, for example, between genetic data and different types of cancers and severity, and even COVID-19. And this is, in fact, what we're seeing pharmaceutical companies doing, healthcare organizations doing, and even governments. Speaking of government, just one more use case, one more example, going back to financial crimes. Again, the very nature of financial crimes is that they are wide. They're across different organizations, across different jurisdictions. And it's very challenging for governments and for law enforcement in specific to be able to catch these criminals and do that in real time. Typically, in the United States, for example, these processes take around 6 to 8 weeks just to understand if the data might exist. Imagine being able to get that data much faster without revealing who the subject of that investigation is, potentially ruining his or her reputation. Being able to get that data very quickly to understand, is this something worth pursuing? Should we go and file a subpoena? Should we go file a warrant? Really understanding the scale and the nature of these different types of crimes to make the process in actually being proactive around stopping crime much more efficient. So hopefully this helped paint a broader picture of the different types of use cases and the value of using all data and thinking about the paradigm shift of what all data actually means in this context. So Michael, back to you.
Thanks, Renan. So with that, like thinking of using all of the data, what does that actually mean, right? Because that in and of itself is, you may be hearing us talk and go, hold on a sec, I can't do that. I can't share all of the data because I am bound by regulation and policy not to. Well, I think that once you get past this idea, and I'll spend a little bit of time talking about how you solve that particular problem. But assuming that you can leverage all of the data, you can actually improve not just your business outcomes, but as Renan alluded to, societal outcomes. The healthcare example is such a great example of one of those things that would benefit all of us. And I would argue that many have tried to solve these challenges previously, but simply have not been able to do so because of regulation, because of the concern of I can't let my intellectual property get exposed in the wild. I would argue that there are ways by which you can solve this problem. And to get around that, you need to actually address the challenges as to why this problem has not been solved previously. The whole notion of data residency, where is the data? Who can get access to it? Is someone requesting that data from outside of that jurisdiction? Who within that jurisdiction can get access to the data? Who can see what governance framework do I have in place? Aligning the data schemas to ensure that the data from group A can communicate with the data from group B. How do I ensure that I have the appropriate consent, and how do I address and ensure that my policy is in keeping with how it is that I actually want to use the data? The good news is that these long-standing issues can be resolved using technologies such as that which Duality provides. For instance, if you were able to combine genomic and clinical trial data, you'd be able to target conditions that would drastically improve the outcomes. If you could query sensitive data within your own bank, you could provide more targeted offers to your clients about relevant products and services that they actually might need. Ultimately, from this, we're finding that new revenue streams are being created to include things like more rapid development cycles, higher success rates in clinical trials, incremental revenue associated with data that you have not been able to leverage previously to drive revenue streams for that product that may have only been growing at 1 or 2% previously. What if you could double that just by tapping into the data and using it in a more effective manner? So ultimately, what we're seeing is that these organizations are redefining their business model to focus on this notion of collaboration. When you just think about the sheer volume of data that a financial services or healthcare organization has that they don't use, that number is typically heard to be north of 95%. The data is simply stored and secured for regulatory and privacy reasons, but it is never, ever leveraged. So what we're seeing is that commercial and government organizations, they're turning to technologies now that allow them to leverage all of this data, keeping it private and secure while enabling it still to be used, improving patient outcomes, improving pharmacological impact of drugs, reducing cybercrime, improving advertising delivery. All of these things can be done while keeping the data private. So some examples of this and the benefits associated with data collaboration, some of which have been discussed before, but some I'll, just so that you, based on the vertical that you're in, may think about this a little bit more broadly. So from a financial perspective, just simply improving customer experience and improving revenues, you have the ability to target offers to your customers with external partners, right? Just leveraging and developing these partnerships that you probably already have, but probably aren't leveraging fully. Ultimately, improving business decisions, just generating better insights between teams that were not possible without privacy-preserving data analytics. And then lastly, from a financial perspective, risk mitigation by reducing financial crime. From a manufacturing perspective, what if you could actually improve yields by leveraging third-party models to improve the recipes and formulations that you're developing for the chemicals you're manufacturing, the consumer packaged goods products that you have, the pharmaceutical products that you're developing, or oil and gas products, just as a for instance. And then lastly, from a healthcare perspective, what if you could do things like the improving the research that you're doing, reducing cycle times, just because data associated with the information that's being collected can be used more effectively related to the rare disease scenario that Ronen referred to. But what if you could also reduce the cycle time associated with completing not just patient enrollment, but also understanding what is happening within those clinical trials by leveraging more data sources at the same time. So lots of examples of how this technology is being utilized to benefit organizations by allowing them to collaborate more on data, both internally and externally, using data sources that have previously been untapped. Duality has such a platform and has partners that can work with you to ensure that your organization can rapidly transform into a more data-driven enterprise. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. Lucy, have there been any questions?
Yes, we do have a few questions in the chat window. Just a reminder that if you have some questions now, you can still enter them in. So the first question is, many of the examples you gave are around collaborating outside of your own organization, where I can clearly see the value. Is there also value to be unlocked in just using your own data internally?
Yeah, Vernon, I'll go ahead and start this one. So certainly many organizations are bound by regulation, as a for instance, that they can't share data. The classic example of that is the investment banking group and the analyst group, right? Or the credit card organization and the retail bank. But what if there are a way by which they could gain insights to understand how they can more effectively target a product that might be relevant to an individual based on something that's happening in their life? What if there's the means by which you could actually see that if you offer insurance, and you may also be a bank, that someone had just purchased a new house, maybe they've just taken a mortgage out. Chances are they need homeowners insurance. What if you could more effectively offer them a policy that would be appropriate and timely? You can't do that today just because the data can't be shared. Renan, any other examples?
Yeah, largely speaking, there are many challenges in sharing data internally in an organization. So Michael alluded to one of them, which is around cross-team collaboration. So how can you share, for example, insights that a team might need for business decisions without having to share all the underlying data itself? And so the example, Michael, that you gave around home insurance is a perfect one. Another example is around cross-border information sharing for multinationals, as an example. So they're, getting a holistic view, for example, of a customer that you might have, or around your supply chain or manufacturing processes, being able to understand that in different locations, different subsidiaries that you might have, or different teams across different countries, are also areas where there's a definite need for collaboration. And so, Lucy, to answer the question, it's not just two companies, two organizations or more. It's also internally, across teams, across branches, across jurisdictions, that there's a need for collaboration.
Okay, moving on to the next question. Are there quantifiable benefits that your clients have seen that you can share?
Yeah, I can take a couple of those as an example. So we spent some time talking about healthcare. We recently did a project with Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Harvard, where they needed to compare and really correlate genetic data with cancer data to understand how does this gene affect this type of cancer and the severity, and which drug might or might not work. And what they found is that they were able to get to a result 30 times faster using our privacy technology versus any other method that exists out there. And so being able to get to an answer on a very important question around cancer treatments 30 times faster seems pretty impactful. Another example in financial services, we could take an example in financial crime, where to get data around, for example, money flows in the UK or in Canada takes something like 6 to 8 weeks. In the United States, it takes 6 to 9 months to get responses and results on those sorts of questions that are really useful and necessary to stop fraud and stop money laundering and terrorist financing and so on and so forth. And so there we're able to take those processes and also bring them down to minutes. And so that's very impactful to the bottom line of an organization. We actually recently did a study with IT where they found that the top 5 or 7 banks in Canada would be able to save over $1 billion a year around fraud losses were they able to collaborate more effectively. And so those are the different types of metrics that one can think about: cost reduction, revenue generation, customer experience, time to data. Those are kind of the different ideas swirling around how to track and how to quantify the benefits of collaboration. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, and I think it helps with the next one, which is you've talked about the benefits of collaboration. How are you doing this? How are we doing this?
I'll go ahead and take this one. So I think that the question, even phrased better, might be, how are you doing collaboration with all of the sensitive data while protecting it, right? And that's the key, is how do we protect it and keep the private data private? So what Duality provides is a platform that allows you to leverage privacy preserving technologies that are appropriate based on the use case that you're trying to satisfy. One example might be, I have 2 data sets from 2 separate organizations that both contain intellectual property that is sensitive and needs to remain private just to the respective organization. What if there is a way by which you can encrypt that data, combine it, perform analysis on it while it remained encrypted, and derive insights from it? That's an example. What if you could actually provide, one of the examples that Ronen talked about, collect all of the relevant healthcare data related to the rare disease across the 10 or 20 or 30 healthcare systems that actually treated patients that have those diseases. Obviously, they contain tons of personal health information. What if there's a way by which you could query those data sets and extract insights from them without ever revealing any information about the individual, such that you're able to combine the result set, perform analysis on it, that would subsequently inform and improve the quality of care for every patient across all of those healthcare systems, or improve the next iteration of the drug that is being used to treat those individual patients? Those are examples of how you can apply privacy preserving technologies to improve collaboration.
All right, well, we said we wanted to keep these pretty short, so this feels like a good place to wrap up. If we didn't get to your question, we will follow up with a response via email. If you would like to meet with a member of our solutions team for a one-to-one demo or to discuss your data needs, please go to the link on the screen. We will also follow up with you later today in an email that will include links to learn more. Thank you for participating in our webinar series. We hope to see you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.